Good morning. My name is Angela Hvitved. As Misty said, there are staff in our office whose sole purpose is to do educational trainings and workshops such as this, and I am one of these people. So I'm in the Division of Education at OHRP. And I'm going to be talking today about, the title of our talk is Back to Basics. So we're going to take a step back after Ivor's excellent overview of all the different changes that are coming and some of the features of particular interest to this group. This is going to be a little bit more general, and we're going to talk about how to apply the regulations to your research activities, and we're going to talk about in the context of the pre-2018 or current. I'll go ahead and say current. I actually use that a lot, even though it is time sensitive, and then the revised common rule. So this is a little overview of the structure, because in trying to integrate the new upcoming changes with the current material that we have, it can be sort of difficult to be jumping back and forth. And so the way that we're going to go through this is that I'm going to talk just a little bit about the OHRP background and the role of our office. And then we will go through the process of determining if the regulations apply to research activities. First, we're going to walk through it pretty quickly using the current pre-2018 common rule. And then we're going to actually start over again and go through the whole process a little bit slower using the revised common rule and talk about the changes that occur at the different points and how they pertain to making these decisions. So there is a method to what might look like madness, I promise. So you'll just have to bear with me. You'll kind of see how the structure unfolds as we go. So first off, the HHS Office for Human Research Protections. Our office is responsible for leadership protecting the rights, welfare, and well-being of human subjects in research. You know, we have an education office. You're probably also, or a division. We also have a compliance division, and then a division that is responsible for policy, guidance, interpretation, and regulations. So OHRP as an office has very distinct roles from what you might also think would play a role in human research protections, which is FDA and the NIH. And so we often find there's a lot of confusion of exactly who we are, where we sit in the structure, but we're part of HHS. FDA and NIH are also part of HHS. But the FDA has its own set of regulations that are specific for the type of work that it does, because they regulate clinical trials that involve drugs, devices, biologics. They have certain features that they need for their regs, whereas NIH, in the research that it sponsors, actually has to comply with our regulations if it involves human subjects. So we hold the regulatory authority for the HHS Human Subjects Protections regulations. Subpart A, which is what we spend most of our time talking about, is referred to as the common rule. And it was the common rule specifically that underwent the revision process. So everything that Ivor discussed pertains to the common rule itself. But there are actually additional subparts in the HHS regulations that apply to all of the research that is sponsored or conducted by HHS entities. And so we're going to talk a little bit, very briefly, about some of these, but primarily in the context of how they pertain to the revised common rule. So we're going to start by stepping through this process of determining when the regulations apply. And first we're going to use the pre-2018 or current common rule. So the regulations apply to any non-exempt human subjects research sponsored by HHS. And in order to figure out whether the research that you're considering is non-exempt human subjects research, you need to ask these three questions in this order. And you'll see the order is very important. So does the activity involve research? Does the research involve human subjects? And is the research with human subjects exempt from the regulations? And I know this seems really basic, but I promise you, we go through this all the time, even in our own office. We'll start discussing something, and we kind of get down into the weeds and try to figure out if this pertains to this. And then you sort of step back and be like, wait, we didn't even, like, is this actually human subjects research? It's really helpful, no matter how many times you have done this, to always go through and take it one step at a time and follow through each of these steps. So first, is it research? If it's not, then you stop, right? The regulations don't apply to what you're talking about. If it is, then you go through whether or not this research involves human subjects. So again, if the answer is no, you're done. Regulations don't apply. However, if the answer is yes, then you can start looking at the exemptions, and you determine whether or not the study is exempt. Now you'll see here that the little diagram flipped a bit. So if the answer is yes, then you can stop because the study's exempt. But you'll see the exclamation point that says, OHRP recommends investigators not make this determination themselves. So we're not going to talk anymore about this particular aspect of it, but deciding whether or not a study is exempt is something that will depend on institutional practices and policies. A lot of institutions have their own mechanism for the investigator to submit a study to get an answer for this. So yes, it's very rare that an investigator would be sort of going through the regulations themselves and deciding whether or not it's exempt. If it's not exempt, then you're off to IRB review. So we'll go through these kind of briefly. So does the activity involve research? So again, we're going back to, this is the current pre-2018 common rule definition. And research refers to a systematic investigation, including research, development, testing, and evaluation, designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. Right? So you see in bold these two phrases, systematic investigation and generalizable knowledge. And those are really the two key points that you have to keep in mind when you're thinking about this. Right? Was there a hypothesis? Was there a question that you wanted to answer? Did you set out with the intention of solving a particular problem? All of these things indicate then that the activity you're thinking about is research. Whereas, if it's a one-off case study that might not actually be generalizable, or the intention is to focus on one specific incident or event, then it's likely not research. Of course, the devil's always in the details, and so it's really hard to make grand pronouncements ahead of time, but these are the two things that you need to sit and think through when you're making this decision. So then the second question is, if you determine that it is research, is it human subjects research? So a human subject, according to the regulations, is a living individual about whom the investigator obtains either data through an intervention or an interaction, or obtains identifiable private information. Right. So you can kind of see the first aspect, an intervention or action, is generally primary research, where you're engaging directly with people. The second can be either primary research or secondary research, which is what Ivor talked quite a bit about, where you have access to someone's information and you have identifiable information as part of that data set. So under this heading of human subjects research comes work with biospecimens, which, as you all are aware, is a much more complicated and tricky question to answer. But the regulations have been interpreted to be that if research only involves, if it's only coded biospecimens or private information, either one, and it meets these two conditions, it's not collected specifically for the research in question, and the investigators cannot readily ascertain the identity of the individuals, then it's not considered human subjects research. And we have some questions. We'll be doing clicker questions a little bit later on. And so I'm sure you're all very familiar with the coded biospecimens policy, but it's good to review it because it is complicated. So then once you've decided that the activity is research, it is human subjects research, then you can think about whether or not this particular human subjects research is exempt from the regulations. So the pre-2018 regulations have 6 exemptions. We'll go through them pretty quickly. Normal educational practices in established educational settings, educational tests, surveys and interviews, or observation of public behavior, unless the information is identifiable and sensitive. Number 3 is research on elected or appointed public officials or candidates. Number 4 is research using existing data, if it's publicly available or recorded without identifiers. Number 5 is the evaluation of public benefit service programs. And the last is the taste and food quality evaluation or consumer preference studies. So 1, 2, and 4 are the most commonly used. We're going to talk in a lot more detail later about how the revised common rule impacts the different exemptions, but I wanted to briefly remind you that these are the 6 that are currently in effect. Okay, clicker time. Everyone should have clickers on their table. So we're going to go through sort of at each different section of the talk. We're going to have a few clicker questions that you can answer, and they'll usually pertain to the material that we just covered. So I think the poll is open. So a team of physicians sees a patient with an unusual constellation of symptoms. They run a variety of diagnostic tests and procedures. The results of the tests don't yield a known diagnosis. So the group decides to write a case summary of their observations and submits it for publication to a medical journal. Is this activity considered research under the regulations? And you can click in using your clickers. I actually can't see how many. You guys get 3 more seconds. You got nothing to lose. No one knows who you are. Okay? What do we have? 43. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead. Yeah, if you don't have a clicker, grab one because we have quite a few of these questions coming up. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. No. Excellent. Right? So this is not considered research according to the regulations because we think back to the 2 major points that determine whether or not an activity is research. It's systematic investigation. This was not a systematic investigation. This was a patient who showed up with a really unusual set of symptoms. You know, they didn't set out to find someone who had a particular disease. So it's certainly not a systematic investigation. And it's also unlikely, unlikely that this is generalizable knowledge, right? Because you have this one case study that you're investigating. Okay. So, a professor in education wishes to study the relationship between study habits and time to graduation. She plans to conduct surveys about study habits with graduate students in several universities and track their graduation status to determine if there's a correlation. Would this study be considered research under the regulatory definition? There's more, you know. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Okay, and 70% of you say that, yes, this would be research. And for the same things we just discussed in the last question, right here, if you think about systematic investigation, she set out to answer a question. right? She knew what she wanted to find out beforehand. She knew what she wanted to answer. And then she developed a method, some kind of way to answer this question. And also with the idea that it would translate into other populations, other individuals. So it wasn't just looking at the study habits of this particular cohort at the university, but the idea was to gain this knowledge in order to make it useful and generalizable to other groups. Does anyone want to, so we have, 20% say it depends on the survey questions. Does anyone want to volunteer or discuss why they think the exemption might not? Or I mean, why this might not be research? No? So I think one thing that some of you might be thinking is that this could be exempt, which is true, right? Depending on what is going on in this particular study, it's possible that it would be eligible for an exemption, right? But it is certainly research. It's human subjects research. Then, as you move down the chain of asking these questions, you might find that it could be exempt. So that might be what you're thinking. Okay. So one more. An investigator received survey data on the use of opioid medications from an outside source. These data were obtained for a previous and unrelated research study, not the current research. The investigator cannot identify the surveyed participants. Would this be human subjects research? Okay, so 62% of you said no. That's actually the case for this example. So if we think back to what the definition of human subjects were that we talked about, it's an interaction or intervention with a living individual. And in this case, these data were obtained for another unrelated study. The person who's doing this study has had no interaction with the individuals whose data they're using. But also, there's no privately identifiable information, right? So they've received the data that were collected for another study. They've received them without any identifiers. So this actually would not be human subjects research under the definition because of those two criteria. And if anyone wants to volunteer or discuss any of these, feel free to raise your hand.
I could, I just asked previous presenter.
I'm gonna bring you your mic so everybody can hear, if you don't mind.
As Native nations, they like to use our data, but it's more easily identifiable than other populations. For instance, I just talked about we've got 500 students in our high school. So if they do research at our school and they say in a northern Native American school with a population of 500, everybody knows it's Turtle Mountain. So that was one thing that concerns. But they do what they call a YRBS, Youth Risk Behavior Survey. And I have concerns about it because they kind of pressure us. They want us to take it because we're such a huge Native American population as compared to the other Native schools in the state. So we say no, and they give us like up to 3-4 requests sometimes. And my question was, they ask questions about sex and smoking and drinking, and I can't remember all of them, if that was an exempt. And the answer was, actually what we talked about was most of the data they collect is used in secondary research. And so that would make it exempt, that particular data. And so that's what I was trying to find out, because we're kind of protective of how much research they do in our populations.
Yeah. So, so first, the issue of identifiability can be really tricky. We generally, so the interpretation has been readily identifiable, and that can change and vary depending on, as you said, the kind of data that you have and the population about whom you have that data, right? So if it's a rare disease and there are only a handful of individuals in the region of the country, and if you remove the obvious identifiers from that, but still leave perhaps gender and age, it's not unreasonable to think that you can actually re-identify those individuals just based on the information that you have, which gets at your concern. And and generally, and Ivor and Misty will both jump in, if they have thoughts. But generally, that's been considered. If you can easily figure out who it is, if the investigator could sit down and determine who those individuals are by the information that you have, then that's considered identifiable, right? There's not a hard and fast rule set for, it's not like HIPAA where, you have things that are specifically designated as identifiable or not. In terms of the exemption, that's trickier, I know. I think Ivor's probably best positioned to answer the specific question just because he works on these issues, but...
We talked about it a little bit. And it is, we said public survey? NIMH?
We're gonna have to cut this up a bit because first of all, with respect to identification, for better or for worse, the regulations look at identification at the level of the individual. Right, so your concern, you may well have a legitimate concern about research findings that have to do with the members of a of a population, right? But the regulations don't decide about whether the regulations apply or not based on membership in a larger population group. With respect then to surveys, in this case, we're changing it a little bit to look at your youth risk thing. If we're looking at information that was previously collected and the investigator can't identify the individual survey participants, yes, it's a secondary research study, and it doesn't count as being human subjects research, so the regulations won't apply. However, in part having to do with your original concern, if the initial research study is a survey that asks questions of individuals, we have to ask whether that's human subjects research, and the answer is definitely yes, because you obtain data by interacting with them, saying, how old are you? How often do you drink? Have you ever smoked cigarettes, etc. Right? So it will be human subjects research. Will it tip the hat? I'm going to steal your thunder, maybe, because under the current rule, the question of exemption for that kind of survey or interview will very much depend on whether we're talking about kids or adults, right? Because if we're talking about kids or adults, if we're talking about adults, there are a couple of different ways that we have to answer the question of whether it's an exemption. But if you're talking about interviews or surveys with kids, it's under the current rule, it's not exempt, period, no matter what you ask them and no matter what you know about who they are. So I'll stop there because I don't want to jump the gun too much
Gave away the ending, I think.
for the other stuff. Maybe I've given away the answer to a quiz. People will get gold stars.
Okay. All right. So before we leave the pre-2018 current rule section, we can do one more quiz question here. So a researcher forms a hypothesis about a certain group of individuals and their responses to current events in the news. She wants to study public tweets related to these current events to establish a correlation and predict behavior. Is this human subjects research? Every time we go, there are more people. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Okay, so almost 70% of you said no, which is correct. So what she's doing here is not human subjects research because, as we discussed, the definition of human subject, right? So she's observing or recording public comments, which is not really an interaction, or it's not considered an interaction with the individuals who are posting these comments. And there may be identifiable information, right? So you might use your full name as your Twitter handle, and so then she knows exactly who the person is. But it's not private information, right? That was publicly available. You put it out on Twitter. If it was publicly viewable, you have to anticipate that people in the public can see it. And so this doesn't meet the second point that we discussed about being identifiable private information. So yes, so although it's certainly research, it certainly could be identifiable. Because it's not private, this would not be considered human subjects research for this activity. So this is just a quick review. Right, we've walked through this process pretty quickly, but looking at whether or not it's research, if it is research, does it involve human subjects? And if it does involve human subjects, is the research exempt? Right, and I think there's the little yield sign. So if the answer to all of those questions points you to it being non-exempt human subjects research, then you need to get ready for IRB review. So now that was just a quick pass through this decision process using the current rules. Now we're going to dive in and go through the same steps, looking at when the regulations apply under the revised common rule. Okay, so fortunately, the first two questions haven't changed a whole lot. So the first question, does the activity involve research, which systematic investigation to contribute to generalizable knowledge, right? The definition of research has not changed under the revised common rule, right? This is still the same definition. It has moved, and also I will say that the definitions were alphabetized, which I was super excited about because I never understood why they weren't before. But they are now. So the citation has moved. But also there are 4 new types of research, not research, there are 4 new types of activities that are specifically and explicitly called out as not being research under the regulations. We're going to go through these. But I think it's important to say at the opening here, the idea is not that these are new things that are no longer research, but rather these explicit carve-outs describe activities that we have not interpreted as research currently or previously. It's just now that it's being made very clear that they are not considered research. So the first is scholarly and journalistic activities focusing on specific individuals about whom this information is collected. So some of the kinds of activities that are provided as examples, but this isn't a restricted set, but some examples are oral history, journalism, biography, literary criticism, legal research, or historical scholarship. So the important point here is that it focuses on specific individuals, right? This isn't trying to describe fields or disciplines that get kind of set aside and are outside the regulations, but it's whether or not whatever kind of study you're proposing, whether or not that focuses on specific individuals and the information that you intend to gather and use pertains only to that individual. So if there were an ethnographic study that we're doing surveys or interviews or collecting oral histories, some of the activities that we've talked about that could fall under this carve-out, but the purpose of that was to maybe interview 2 or 3 individuals with the hope of writing something, creating a body of knowledge that would apply to the entire community, then that would likely not fall under this carve-out, right? Because the idea there is to take whatever the information you have and try to generalize it, try to extend the scope of it, right? And that would be research, right? So here we're just really specifically focusing on a particular individual.
Excuse me, who makes that decision then?
That it is not deemed research. I'm going to let Ivor, who is our policy person.
The regulations are silent about this. And so effectively it would be a matter of institutional policy. I have heard, at various institutions, there are some institutions where they have, they identify specific people or people in various specific offices to make these kinds of determinations, as with exemption decisions. And in the notice of proposed rulemaking, with respect to exemptions, there were identified 2 specific ways of getting to an exemption conclusion. But if you look at the new rule, that has been dropped from the new rule. And so it is a matter of the institution deciding how they will do this, and for well or for ill, it is the case that the government reserves to itself the right to say, if somebody raises a question about whether the decision was made correctly or not, technically the secretary gets the final say in whether the right decision was made or not.
Can I just make a comment on that? So just looking at it from a tribal context, I think, and having worked with some of the CRCAIH tribal partners on developing some of their research codes, a language pertaining to some of this can be included in the research code and then can speak to data collection in general on the reservation and might be able to address some of those concerns.
Thank you, Ivor. I should say, these are new for all of us, so it's not that any of us doesn't want to answer questions, but, until we've had a chance to develop guidance and interpretation, I'll continue deferring to Ivor on the tricky ones so that I don't say anything to get myself in trouble. Okay, so, sorry.
When you refer to the research code, are you referring to regulatory code regarding research, or what do you mean by research code?
Yes, so I should clarify it. So it's basically the tribal law regarding research.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'm hoping that our panel discussion later this afternoon, we will have our tribal IRB members talk about the research review processes and how they've established their IRBs and the process of using tribal law, so we can speak about that more.
Okay. So back to the research carve-outs. The second one that's in the revised common rule pertains to public health surveillance activities. And so it is pretty specific that these activities are limited to only those necessary to identify, monitor, assess, or investigate conditions of public health importance. And it's also important to note that it's set out specifically that these have to be public health authorities, right? So it has to be a public health authority who meets the criteria in, I believe it's the HIPAA regulations set out who is considered a public health authority in this context. So it's not just any hospital or anyone who wants to do it, and it's also very limited. So if, say, an organization who was a public health authority collected data for these particular specific reasons, but then down the road wanted to come back and do some kind of secondary research study using that information to look at maybe environmental factors or some kind of study that would be much more general in scope than what's specified, then that would have to be, that's considered research, right? So the carve-out only pertains to the very limited set of activities that's here. Anytime you want to come back and do secondary research, something further on, then you're within the scope of the regulations, just like any other study would be. The third is collection and analysis of materials for criminal justice purposes. This is actually not something that HHS deals a whole lot with, and the same with the fourth, which is authorized operational activities for national security purposes. These are features of the common rule, right? As we know, the common rule has been codified by multiple agencies, and so some of them, these different carve-outs might be much more relevant, but for our discussion, we're going to focus on just the first two. Okay, some more clicker questions to demonstrate your knowledge about the new carve-outs. So a political science professor wants to write a book about the former governor of his state. He plans to conduct extensive interviews with the former governor and several people who worked with him. Would this be considered research under the revised common rule? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Right, likely no. Right, this is exactly what we discussed just a little bit earlier, right? This, and also I should mention, this would presumably not be research either under the pre-2018, the current common rule, right? Because as we said, this is not considered generalizable knowledge. The point here is not to try and come up with some kind of grand theme or idea or proposal that extends beyond the scope of this particular individual who is being studied. A physician reports an outbreak of an unusual type of meningitis. The public health authority in the area plans to collect patients' medical and demographic information in order to document these trends, identify signals, and risk factors as a way to better manage this potential public health crisis. Would this be considered research, given the carve-outs we just discussed? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close it. Great. So 76% of you said likely no, and that's right. Right. So at least with the information that we have here, what they're proposing to do fits exactly with the second carve-out, right, which is very specific to the current crisis at hand. Right. They're trying to figure out how to respond, how to monitor and track what's going on. And so this would be public health surveillance limited to those specific activities. As I said before, if they decided to take this information after the fact and they wanted to come back and say, what can we do to try and prevent something like this from happening in the future, use the data they collected from this, then that would be research, right? And so then you would move right into the standard decision tree that we've been talking about. But if it's only being collected in response to this current outbreak, then that falls under carve-out number 2. So we've got a little addition to our flow chart here. So is it research? If it's not, or if it falls under the activities deemed not to be research, then the regulations don't apply. If the answer is yes, then we can move on to, does it involve human subjects? So, for the second question, there's not a whole lot of change, which is good because we're going to have a lot to cover with the exemptions changes. But the human subjects definition is substantively the same as it was before. So OHRP sees the additional language that was put into the definition. You'll see it's still about a living individual about whom the investigator obtains information or biospecimens through intervention or interaction with the individual, or obtains, uses, studies, analyzes, or generates identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens, right? We're interpreting this as a clarification of the previous definition. So essentially what you'll see is that places where it may have said data or information before, it is now information or biospecimens. This isn't a change on our part in what we consider the definition of human subject to be. This was just provided for the sake of clarity in the definition. So when you come and read through it, it seems like it covers what it was that we had previously considered to be human subjects research. It's just explicit now in the definition. So when you get to whether or not it involves human subjects, your considerations, the process that you do for making that decision is the same as it would have been, that it would be under the current rule. So if the answer is yes, it is human subjects research, then we move to, is it exempt? And so before we jump into the exemptions, because we also have a 90-minute session and the exemptions are going to take a while to get through, I'm going to take a short break, just like Ivor did, so that you can come back to this ready to dive in. This is what we're going to cover. So how about 5 minutes to just grab some coffee, chat a little bit, get your mind refreshed.
I turned my chair, my neck, not so much my neck, right in the middle of my back.
Guess I'm dancing in my mind.
Like I woke up Sunday and I felt like I slept in. Like I wasted time. Yeah. Sleeping more. I'm just it rained all day.
So eventually we might get to the point where we're lunching.
Damn, but normally get up at 6. That's 5:30.
Okay, I get this done. Like,
Get up before 5 now. I get headache all day. Trying to get. Sometimes you can't.
When it is NDS, which I will.
The dog woke me up about a week ago. Usually she doesn't get until I right about me and when I get up, she start bringing her toys.
I know, I feel like
on my chest. All these departments.
So by the time this comes in,
Oh, yeah. Yep.
wide awake sitting there staring at me.
That's how it is, right? It's outside agencies come in and say, we
Yeah, I still think you're
right, like,
pretty friendly.
Yeah, and pretty well trained. Except when she's outside, leaning out the window, she doesn't track
Deer.
I got lost in the transition. Which is
It's in IRP for assessment. Old IRP. I have a folder that can say that sorry, I just decided so there are 14 folders. Each folder is giving me a chance to look at survey documents and original. Well, if you don't have a lot we are accredited because of DPD,
registration and everything else, yeah. That one, the funny part? Not even nurse.
Interesting.
So what I'm saying is, to me it was like,
And she was presenting she was presenting Congress.
and the reason why I was saying
she doesn't
Which is sort of
you know what I mean? So to me that is something.
I heard, yeah, Todd's can be a lot. Something can be a little, if you're not used to driving. She's taking on the
I'm not used to it. I've driven using there, and that. You can
drive one.
Sure, I can drive, but I have one speed.
So she's doing this last night before she headed out. So yeah, so
I have one speed. I don't know how
It's sort of like,
yeah.
I know where I rank.
Yeah.
That's like what happens. Are you gonna go? Are you gonna I've never done it.
they know about it.
slap them together. Are you going to different?
We're meeting to get to.
So who's University of Northern Iowa.
Yeah, it's true.
Okay, guys, let's go ahead and start settling back down. The exemptions await. So hopefully you've got coffee and you're ready to go. Just 30 short minutes to cover all these exemptions between lunch. Okay. So question 3, right? And this is where we look at whether or not the human subjects research that we're thinking about is exempt from the regulations. Right? This slide is actually just a really brief overview of the major changes that are occurring in the area of the exemptions. So the pre-2018, or I keep calling it the current, for the time being, common rule, had 6 exemptions, and this just shows you where they were found in the regulations. The revised common rule has 8 exemptions. The actual locations, so they've moved from section 101 to 104, just in a different place. Exemptions 3, 7, and 8 are brand new, so there wasn't anything like them in the current exemptions. Exemptions 1, 2, 4, and 5 have been modified in different ways, and we'll go through these in detail. And then exemption 6, there's been no change. So there's at least one that we won't have to really discuss. Okay, so in a little more detail, so exemption 1 has had some restrictions added to it. Exemption 2 has been expanded. Exemption 3 has actually been replaced by a completely new exemption 3, so we'll talk about that briefly. The pre-2018 exemption 3 has been removed completely, and then another new exemption has been put in that location. Exemption 4 has been expanded, as has exemption 5. As we said, exemption 6 has had no change. And then exemptions 7 and 8 are brand new, along with the provision that I've already discussed, which is limited IRB review. So we're going to go through these one at a time. I'm going to do, the plan was to kind of dovetail with Ivor's talk because Ivor focused on secondary research. And so he went into a lot more detail on the exemptions that deal with secondary research, which is 4, 7, and 8. So I'm going to just touch on those briefly and just review some of the major features, but I will focus on the other exemptions that he didn't cover already. Also, regarding the applicability of these exemptions to subpart C and D, there have been some changes that have occurred. So in the pre-2018 rule, subpart C, which was research with prisoners, no exemptions could apply sort of across the board. Whereas in the revised common rule, it's been expanded a bit. So this exemption could apply in research that was intended to target a much broader subject population, but only incidentally includes prisoners, right? So if you have a study that includes a whole broad population, but it happens throughout the course of the study that some of the participants become prisoners, now you would be able to use this exemption for those particular kinds of studies, but only it's limited to just those circumstances. Subpart D, which is research with children. So exemption 2 currently, exemption 2 doesn't apply for research involving surveys, interviews, or observations of children if the investigators participate in the activity being observed. But the other exemptions do apply to children. In the revised common rule, it has the same restrictions for exemption 2, plus a new provision, which is not applicable, and we can discuss what 104D2 Romanet 3 is when we get there. And then also, exemption 3 does not apply to research with children. And we'll cover that in more detail as well. So we're going to go through the exact same process, right? So, and as I said before, this is really just an easy way to try and step through when you're thinking about whether or not the regulations will apply to whatever particular activity you're discussing, right? You work through these questions to get to the answer. But as you can see, the revised common rule has a few more boxes, and it's a little bit more complicated, but hopefully by the end of this, it will be clearer. So we're going to start with Exemption 1. So some restrictions have been added. And so Exemption 1, as we discussed before, was normal educational practices in established or commonly accepted educational settings. So what's new in the revised common rule is the addition that these normal educational practices that are not likely to adversely impact either the student's opportunity to learn the required educational content that they should be learning, or assessment of the educators who provide this instruction. Right, so this is a bit more restrictive than what is in the pre-2018 rule, and that you have to be sure that there won't be adverse impact on either the students or the educators. Exemption 2 is research that only includes interactions involving educational tests, surveys, interviews, and observations of public behavior, which is similar. It's exempt when the information recorded cannot be readily linked back to the subjects, or any disclosure of this information would not place the subjects at a risk of harm. And there are actually specific harms that should be considered, such as criminal or civil liability, whether or not the information might be damaging to the reputation, the employability, the financial standing of the participants. So these are all the kinds of harms that you're expected to consider and think about when deciding whether or not disclosure of this information would cause harm to the participants. Or identifiable information, which could be sensitive information, as discussed in the second point. But if there's a limited IRB review for the privacy and confidentiality protections. So the idea here is that if people are participating in this kind of research, they generally know that they're participating in research. They're voluntarily answering questions. So the primary risks here are disclosure of the information. And so the idea is that, if you either can't identify the subjects, or if the information, maybe they're identifiable, but the information that you're gathering is not particularly risky or potentially harmful, then it's relatively, these are pretty low risks. And so they're exempt as they currently would be. But also, if you have identifiable sensitive information, then if the investigator goes through what's limited IRB review, and the IRB determines that there are appropriate privacy safeguards in place to protect the confidentiality of this information, then the research is eligible for this exemption, as long as that limited IRB review is done and the IRB concludes that these appropriate protections are in place. Okay. Yes?
When you say limited IRB review, does that mean perhaps just what exactly do you mean by limited IRB review?
So the regulations set out some criteria that the IRB needs to consider, but the idea is that the IRB would just have to focus on this specific aspect of the study, right, the privacy protections, and not the larger, the whole study itself, right? So it's not a full IRB review, but it's just restricted to whether or not the investigators are doing what needs to be done in order to protect the confidentiality and prevent disclosure of the data. Yeah.
So would you still have to annually review these exempt studies then to check up on the things that are limited review?
No. So the idea is just that when the IRB goes through to make sure that the privacy protections are in place, then that's done, right? So then with respect to any of the other requirements of the regulations, the study is exempt. So all they have to do is this limited IRB review.
Just one additional consideration here. When we proposed elimination of continuing review for a significant number of studies, some of the comments that came back said something to the effect of, we don't want you to do that because continuing review is when we generally find out what changes to the research study people want to do, and we clean that stuff up, right? Now, our view of that is that you're trying to use a screwdriver to use something that a wrench really ought to be doing. This doesn't in any way change the requirement that any change in a research study has to be approved by the IRB before it can occur. And so while there's no continuing review, right, let's say in the kind of study that we're talking about, somebody, the limited IRB review looked at the protection of the information, and it involved keeping the information in a locked safe, right? When you weren't analyzing it. And the person just decided, I don't want to use that locked safe, I'll just use a file. Now, that would have been a change that the person would have needed to get approval of before they actually did it. But it would be a change to the research. It wouldn't be a continuing review. Does that make sense?
Okay. All right, so let's go on and do a clicker question about this. So a professor wants to study whether students' educational test scores improve if they're exposed to low decibel calming music while they take the exam. So one group of students will take the educational test in a normal classroom environment. The other group will take it in a room with calming background music. The professor will collect the educational tests without individually identifying the students. There won't be any individual identifiable information associated with the exam. Would this research meet the criteria for the revised Exemption 2? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this. Okay. 64% of you think that it likely would. 26% said it likely would not. So actually, the answer is that likely would not meet the criteria for Exemption 2. But it's actually exciting when we get answers like this because it means there's something to talk about. So why wouldn't this meet the criteria for Exemption 2? Right, so if we go back, I'm going to go back a bit. Okay, so research that only includes interactions involving educational tests, surveys, interviews, and observations of public behavior, right? So here, the intervention is the calming music, right? The metric for collecting your data, the way that you're gathering the data that you're interested in, is through this educational test, right? But the music itself is an intervention with the students. And this exemption only applies to educational test surveys, interviews, and observations of public behavior, does not apply to an intervention that we would have in the study that we're talking about. Right? So even though there is an educational test, Exemption 2 would not work for this study. Does that make sense? Do you have any questions? Yeah, it's kind of a trick question. It's not a bad trick question, but it's kind of. All right, I'm going to click through. Okay. So if we've got exemption 2 down, move on to exemption 3. So first off, what happened to the old exemption 3? So the pre-2018 exemption 3 pertained to research involving the use of tests, surveys, and observations if the human subjects were elected or appointed public officials or candidates, or if there were other federal statutes that required the protection of confidentiality. So in that case, the common rule might be duplicative with the other statutes that occur. So this has been removed completely for a couple of reasons. One is that HHS actually did not get a lot of studies involving elected officials or public officials, and so it's not something that we have actually done a lot of anyway, but all of the studies that would have fallen under this fall under some of the other exemptions now. So if it's specific to an individual, say you've got some kind of survey of a political candidate, the idea to hold them publicly accountable, then that would fall under the research carve-out regarding focusing on individuals. So if you're doing journalism, some kind of public accountability of officials, then it just wouldn't be considered research, right? Because you're discussing this specific person and their public record. And as far as the protections for confidentiality, then that would fall under the requirements for the limited IRB review requirements for privacy and confidentiality concerns. So the things that would have been exempt under the current exemption 3 will still be exempt for the most part under the revised common rule. It will just occur in different places in the regulations. So the new exemption 3 is research involving benign behavioral interventions with the collection of information, verbal or written, including data entry or audiovisual recording, from adults who prospectively agree when the information recorded cannot be readily linked back to the subjects, any disclosure would not place the subjects at a risk of harm, or the identifiable information that's recorded is reviewed by or the plans for recording this information and protecting confidentiality are reviewed by an IRB under limited IRB review. So you might recognize these 3 points from the previous exemption, and it's going to operate very similarly. The reason that I read the top part word for word is because there's actually a lot packed into those words. Federal regulations are often really good at packing a lot of information in a very small space. So benign behavioral interventions, strictly behavioral interventions, nothing medical, and the methods of collection that are laid out here, verbal or written or audiovisual recording, it is limited to these specific methods of collection. Also notice the term adults here, right? So this only applies to research with adults. So exemption 3 cannot be used for research with children.
I have another
Yeah.
question. If it's an audiovisual recording, how can the information not be readily linked back to a subject?
So if you have an audiovisual recording,
I'm here in this room and
right.
This is an audiovisual and I'm saying something and you can see my face and I said something.
Right. So it would be okay if you are identifiable, if then the investigators did a limited IRB review to ensure that the appropriate privacy protections are in place. So the idea is that it's okay to have this identifiable information, as long as appropriate measures are being done to prevent disclosure or breach of confidentiality.
I would add just briefly to that as well, the one, just the 2 words in the initial description there that are also important that I'd like to highlight are prospectively agree. In this case, the adults, right, who are the subjects here, it's actually written in here that they have agreed ahead of time. So they'll know that this is going on. So that's also something that's kind of a new tweak thrown in there. Jody, you had a question?
So I'm having trouble with this word benign, behavioral.
You're about to get it. She's about to explain it.
I'm going to go ahead and flip to it and we can discuss it. Yeah.
Okay.
So I put the text up there. Oh, okay. You want to go through it? Okay. I didn't know if you had a specific question.
Yeah, it's hard to, so, to classify them as non-medicals. Not everything non-medical is benign.
Oh, no. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was not my intention. If that's what I said, I apologize. No, the idea here is that they have to be benign and only behavioral, right? So these would be, and as Ivor went through and during his talk as well, this is brief in duration, harmless, painless, not physically invasive, not likely to have significant adverse lasting impact, and the investigator has no reason to think that the subjects will find the interventions offensive or embarrassing, right? So that's a pretty specific set of expectations, although, as Ivor mentioned already, that, deciding what's brief, what's not likely to have significant adverse lasting impact, these are things that reasonable people can discuss, right? And so that's going to require additional work down the road to try and set out some more specific parameters for what that means. And then also just to note that this exemption can include authorized deception research, right? So as long as the participant is told in advance that they may not be told everything, like a full disclosure about the particular study or why it's being done, then it might still be okay to use this exemption. Okay. All right, so let's do another clicker question. Professor wants to study whether students' educational test scores, you may recognize this, improve if they are exposed to low decibel calming music during the exam. One group of students takes the educational test, the other group with the music, the other group takes it in the regular environment, and then the professor is going to collect the educational tests without individually identifiable information. So I already know that this was a no-go for exemption 2, right? But what about exemption 3? Is it possible that the investigator could apply for an exemption 3 on this study? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now. Oh, okay. So this, you guys are going to hate me for these tricky questions. This is the standard OHRP, it depends, right? So if you've ever talked to anyone from our office, we should get a nickel for every time we say this, because this is the most common phrase uttered. It depends. But that's because a lot of times it really does depend. It depends on the details of the study. Sometimes you don't have enough information presented to actually make a determination one way or the other. So, for example here, so far we've talked about a professor and students, right? But we haven't discussed whether or not these might be college students, these are elementary students, right? So exemption 3 only pertains to adults. It cannot be used for studies with children. So in this case, if they're all adults who are taking it, then yes, it might be that exemption 3 does apply. However, if they are children, then no, exemption 3 could not apply. Additionally, whether or not this is a benign behavioral intervention, it seems like it's reasonable to think that calming, perhaps classical music playing in the background would be a benign behavioral intervention. Maybe if it were, I don't know, a recording of car collisions played at a really high volume over and over, and you were supposed to try and take a test while that was occurring, then you could argue whether or not, what you're proposing is actually benign behavioral intervention. So yeah, it's really going to depend on the details of the study, at least in this case.
We're not going to have any more tricky questions, are we?
I don't think so.
Discussion though.
I know it's boring if you guys all get it right and there's nothing to say. All right. No, but I will say it depends as, we don't even think of that as tricky. It's just, it's by necessity. All right, so let's go on to Exemption 4. So Exemption 4 has been expanded a bit in the Revised Common Rule. And this is using secondary research use of identifiable private information or biospecimens for which consent is not required if identifiable private information or the biospecimens are publicly available, or the information is recorded in an unidentifiable manner. And I will point out now, for the sake of not tricking you guys later, that the requirement that all the data be existing at the time of submission is no longer the case for Exemption 4, right? So I'm sure if any of you know the pre-2018 Exemption 4, when you propose a study, if you want to use this exemption, the data have to all currently be in existence. That's actually not the case now under the Revised Common Rule. The investigator's use is regulated under HIPAA, or research is conducted on behalf of a federal agency using information collected or generated by the government for non-research purposes. Okay, so Ivor has gone through exemptions 4, 7, and 8 pretty thoroughly because these are the ones that pertain to secondary research. So I think I will go ahead and move on to some of the quiz questions that we have for these, unless you guys have additional questions. Okay, so as long as the proposed secondary research activities fit the criteria of one of the provisions in Exemption 4 under the Revised Common Rule, no IRB review is required. Is that true or false? Okay, so we'll go ahead and close this. Okay. Sort of a split crowd. All right. So actually, this is true. And so I'm going to go back to the different provisions included in Exemption 4, right? So if you're using identifiable private information or biospecimens, right? If they're publicly available, or if you use them, even though the identifiable information might be available, but it's not recorded. So say you have access to some medical records, but when you go through and record the information for your own use, the data set you create just has perhaps the ages and health status of the individuals. So the identifiable information was available, but it wasn't recorded and you're not using it in your study, right? Then these activities would be exempt under Exemption 4. And then also, as we said, this issue of they don't have to be existing at the time. regarding the use of HIPAA-protected data, if the institution holding the data is HIPAA-regulated and the researcher who's using the data is part of a HIPAA-regulated entity, then you would also qualify for Exemption 4. And then, well, the issue of federal research wasn't specific to the question that we had. But essentially, if you meet any of these criteria, then you can use Exemption 4, and there are no other requirements, right? So there's no limited IRB review required. There are no other things that you have to do. You just have to meet these criteria.
Can I ask a question with respect to that? So you have a HIPAA-covered, oh, thank you. So you have a HIPAA-covered entity, and they have an affiliated academic health sciences center that's a hybrid entity. And that hybrid entity has said our School of Medicine researchers and School of Medicine is not covered. It's a non-covered component. And so when that and they have their own IRB, when that non-covered component gets PHI from the affiliated covered entity and wants to use it for research, and they say this is the School of Medicine's research, they could not use that exemption because both of them are not covered by HIPAA. When they have chose to be non-covered, they haven't afforded themselves any additional flexibility under this.
Right.
I think it's a huge understanding of the rule here. Because a lot of places decided not to cover their research activities.
Yeah, I mean,
And that's an excellent point, that they have to be covered. The
Right.
researcher part
Yeah.
has to be covered.
I mean, there is the part which I don't know the details of, which is that if you meet the criteria for a business associate, right, then you could still be covered, right? But I would imagine that the kind of entities that you're talking about are not
Correct.
business associates precisely because they don't want to have to comply with those regulatory
Right,
requirements.
exactly. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. All right, so we have one more quiz question on this exemption. You have a collection of pancreatic tissue blocks with patient identifiers in storage. These were leftover clinical specimens. You now wish to conduct research with these specimens. As your study progresses, you'll receive more pancreatic tissue left over from clinical care. These will be provided to you with identifiable information of the patients. Would you be able to do this research under Exemption 4 of the Revised Common Rule? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this. Let's see. Half of you say no. 20% say yes, and then 33% got the OHRP. It depends, right? So actually, in this case, it does depend on some particular features of the study that aren't provided here. So if you are recording the identifiable information of the patients for use in this study, then it would not fall under this exemption. However, because just because that information is available, if you do not record that as part of your data set that you're moving forward with, then you could use this exemption for this study. And also, as we discussed earlier, previously, because the samples continue coming in throughout the course of the study, previously that wouldn't have been eligible for this exemption, but under the Revised Common Rule, it would be. Okay. All right, so Exemption 5 has been expanded a bit. We'll go through this. I see we're getting close to lunchtime, so we'll go through this pretty quickly. But this is public benefit and service programs and research demonstration projects. And the main difference here is that the pre-2018 rules applied specifically to federally conducted research, which was essentially, that done by federal agents or contractors, and it's been expanded to include federally supported research. So the same kind of studies, but now if they're done under a granting mechanism rather than just a contract. Now if they're supported by a grant, they would also fall under this. And also there's a requirement that the agencies have to publish a list of these projects on a website. Exemption 6, there's not any change. So we'll just fly that. Although I'm not sure how many of you are doing taste and food quality evaluation studies, but if you were, there's no changes you need to know about. Exemption 7 and 8, I've recovered in quite a bit of detail because they also pertain to secondary research, but just really briefly, we'll review them again because I know you've had a lot of information thrown at you today. So exemptions 7 and 8, they're brand new exemptions. They both involve broad consent and limited IRB review, or can. Exemption 7 focuses on the storage and maintenance of identifiable private information or biospecimens for secondary research. And then exemption 8, these are kind of a pair. We anticipate they'll generally be used together. Exemption 8 is actually the secondary research that uses these identifiable private information or biospecimens. Cut off the top of exemption 8. These are just some of the specific criteria regarding the use for exemption 8. So there has to be limited IRB review to determine whether or not the research activities that are being proposed actually fall within the scope of the broad consent that's been obtained. Then, of course, there has to be a documentation or a waiver of documentation of this broad consent. Limited IRB review regarding the privacy and confidentiality safeguards. The investigator, and as long as the investigator is not planning to return individual research results as part of the study plan. So you guys already discussed this a bit. There might be laws that apply, incidental findings that come up. That's not what this is referring to. This is referring to if you have a plan to return the study results as part of the project that you're proposing. Then you won't be able to use exemption 8. So this is a brief overview of broad consent. Again, this is an option. It's an alternative that's being provided. OHRP considers this an additional flexibility, but aren't any activities that will require the use of broad consent. And an important point here again is that the IRB cannot waive consent if individuals have been asked for broad consent and refused to provide it. And then a brief summary of this discussion of limited IRB review. There are a couple different exemptions that this pertains to. So when we were looking at exemptions 2 and 3, and 7 and 8, there will be some provisions for assessing the measures being taken for privacy and confidentiality, preventing disclosure. And then also in exemption 7 and 8, there are other reviews that the other features that the IRB can look at with respect to the broad consent and whether or not the project is within scope. Okay, so we'll do one more quiz question. Your institution decides to make use of the new exemption 7 and 8 to facilitate future secondary research where the investigators need access to identifiable patient information. Every patient is now asked to provide broad consent for future secondary use of their biospecimens. For those few who decline, the IRB will be allowed to waive informed consent if the use is vital to the scientific validity of research. You guys can get this. Just discussed it. Okay, yay! 80% say false. Right? So, as we just went through, right, if people are asked for broad consent for a study, in that situation, when it pertains specifically to broad consent, the IRB cannot waive use of their samples if they have refused to provide broad consent. Oh, I think I went the wrong way, sorry. Okay, as long as there is broad consent for secondary research use of subjects' identifiable private information or biospecimens, researchers can use Exemption 8 without limited IRB review. This one's also an easy one. Okay, I'm closing it in 3, 2, 1. Okay. This is false, right? So sorry, my finger was leaning on it. So one of the requirements of using this exemption is that there has to be IRB review to determine whether or not the proposed activities are within the scope of the broad consent that's been provided. So the answer is false. You will have to do some kind of limited IRB review in order to use this exemption. Okay, so this is just an overview of the whole process with all of the revised common rule components added to it. You guys are going to get these slides. And this is sort of a disclaimer. We ask that you look to the actual text of the regulations for more details and specifics. And also we are developing materials, educational materials, and of course guidance that will be posted on our website. And I'm going to make one housekeeping comment that I don't know if this is what Jody's approaching me for, but if you registered and signed in today but did not provide your email address, please make sure that you give that to them so that you can get a copy of all the slides, because those are going to be emailed out after the fact.